Welcome. My name is Antonio Arce. I'm the Director of International Development for Latin America and Europe at Duke University. In this role, I work with parents and alumni in both regions to engage them with Duke in meaningful ways, to help build the Duke brand globally, and to secure philanthropic resources for Duke, specifically focused on building scholarships and supporting research. I'd like to thank all of you, all the Duke alumni, parents, and friends of the university for joining us tonight or this afternoon from many parts of the Americas as we launch this new series, Conversations with Leaders, Latin America and the Caribbean. Tonight's event is Creating Quality Cities, a critical challenge of our time, with Duke alumnus and two-time former mayor of Bogotá, Colombia, Enrique Peñalosa. Before we begin, from all of us at Duke, we really wish you and your families all the best as we continue to struggle with and endure this pandemic. 3 or 4 months ago, we surveyed many of you and we asked you, how can we maintain and even build a relationship, a community of Duke in Latin America during this pandemic? How might we inspire you? How might we at Duke create something that you find valuable for your personal life or professional life? And what can we do to convince you to tune in? The overwhelming feedback was that we organized a series of discussions with leaders from the region who are having a positive impact on society through governance, policy reform, innovation, scientific discovery, or entrepreneurship. So the event tonight and this series is a direct result of your request. I would like to thank the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies and the Duke University Hispanic and Latino Alumni Association for co-sponsoring this series. We're especially happy to collaborate with DULA and include the thousands of alumni who are in the United States but have strong ties to Latin America. The format for tonight's event is as follows. I will briefly introduce our moderator and our guest speaker. We will hear opening remarks from Senor Peñalosa, followed by a short discussion between our two guests. After that, we will address as many questions as possible that have been submitted from the audience. And so that everyone knows, we are recording the event tonight and it will be sent to everyone who has registered a day or two after the event. I'd now like to introduce our moderator, Ambassador Patrick Duddy. Ambassador Duddy is the director of the Duke Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies and senior advisor to the Duke Office of Global Affairs. He has taught both in the Fuqua School of Business and the Sanford School of Public Policy. From 2007 to 2010, he served as U.S. Ambassador to Venezuela. Prior to this post, he served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Western Hemisphere, and before that, as Consul General in Sao Paulo, Brazil, among many other posts in the Foreign Service. He retired from the Department of State in 2011 after an illustrious career of nearly 3 decades. Welcome, Ambassador Duddy. Our guest speaker this evening is Enrique Peñalosa, an internationally respected leader in the field of urban planning. Peñalosa graduated from Duke in 1977 with dual degrees in economics and history. He served as mayor of Bogotá, Colombia 2 times, from 1998 to 2001, and from 2016 to 2019. As mayor, he constructed the first expansive bikeway outside of China and Northern Europe. He also built Transmilenio, Bogotá's rapid transit bus system, which has inspired similar systems in cities across the globe. Peñalosa also created quality housing projects for more than 500,000 people, renovated the city center, including the creation of a 44-acre park downtown, and helped construct nearly 100 new schools, many located in the poorest communities of Bogotá. Enrique Peñalosa has advised many governments on urban issues and on the leadership it takes to make complicated city projects a reality. His current passion and focus is on creating quality cities that improve mobility, public space, and promote a more equitable and better quality of life. Senor Peñalosa is truly a leader of consequence, and we're honored to have him with us tonight. I'll now turn over the program to Ambassador Duddy to get started.
Thank you, Antonio, and welcome to everyone around the Americas and in the United States. And if I'm not mistaken, there are even some viewers further abroad than that. It is a great honor for me to host this evening's program with Mayor Peñalosa. He has had an immense impact on Bogotá, but also on the thinking around the Americas in terms of what is possible in our still burgeoning urban landscapes. Enrique, it is a pleasure to have you here. I know you have a presentation with which we can initiate our discussion, but before I turn it over to you, I do want to emphasize how very pleased we are that you have been able to join us and how very interested we are in your suggestions. I think that one of the things that many of us recognize is that in the aftermath of the pandemic, life in many of our cities is going to be very, very different. So with that very short preamble, I give you, ladies and gentlemen, Mayor Enrique Peñalosa.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Patrick, and thank you very much, Antonio. It is a pleasure to meet with the Duke community and to share a few ideas about what the cities can be. I am sorry because this is not, my PowerPoint is not moving. Now, the way we make our cities will determine, more than almost anything else, human well-being for hundreds of years to come. When we design and create a city, we are really designing a way of life. The way a city is designed defines, for example, if we walk to the store, if we walk to buy bread, if we have to drive instead, if we have a park nearby. So to a large degree, when we design a city, what we are doing is to design a way of life. And over the next 50 years, the world's urban population will double. This is something that will never happen again in history. It's a very important moment. But cities will grow much more than population growth because households are becoming smaller. So, for example, if we have households of 4 people, and there are many cities with households larger than that, and households become households of 2 people, we need 2 homes for the same 4. And this is happening. So cities will grow because populations are growing and also because households are becoming smaller, including that's happening in the United States. But also because as societies become wealthier, many buildings which are not housing increase as a share of the total amount of buildings, such as universities, offices, warehouses, gyms, restaurants, and so on. So the growth will be huge. Sub-Saharan African cities will grow more than 10 times what they are now. That means that the cities that will be in existence in 50 years almost have not even begun to be built. In India, they will grow 5 times what they are today. Well, some more, some less, but on average. In Latin America, cities will double their size. And we have huge problems in all of these developing regions. For example, at this time, we have more than 1 billion people living in slums. This means, in some cases, well, in many cases, don't have streets, or they don't have pavement, they don't have water, they, in some cases, don't even have electricity. And millions of people are increasing the slum population every week, every week. This is happening mainly because of private property of land. We need much more government control of land in developing cities so that we can design the city. Even if we cannot make the well-paved streets at the beginning, we could at least leave the public spaces for the future, for parks, for roads, etc. Because these cities could be wonderful if we plan them well from the start. But this is not, cities are not only growing in the developing world. In the United States, there is a huge growth. According to US Census bureaus and other numbers, in the United States, they will build more homes over the next 50 years than today exist in the United Kingdom, France, and Canada put together. So the United States will have a huge effort in urban construction over the next 50 years. How will those cities that the US build will be? Will they be the same as they are now? Just more suburbs, farther away suburbs? Or how can they be? How do we want them to be? With COVID-19, as Ambassador Patrick was saying, many people anticipated great changes in cities. Many think that cities will disappear because people work at their computers. And so people think, well, people don't need to be in a city. They can work out in a faraway country house, in a mountain, in the beach. But I don't think that will happen. When the telephone was invented, people also predicted that people would not go to the office any longer, that they would work from home. Actually, cities, I believe, are necessary for many things. They are necessary for creativity and productivity. A wonderful author, Edward Glaser, has studied in the United States, for example, and the higher the density, the greater the productivity is in American cities. In a city, there is much more diversity. There are more kinds of restaurants. There are different kinds of people can meet different kinds of art or different classes, astronomy or ancient Greek, or different kinds of people, different kinds of interests. And so this is more likely to be a more productive, more creative environment. Also, cities, even though it sounds strange, they can be more sustainable because people can walk. In a dense city, people walk to the store. They don't need to take a car, or they can ride a bicycle to work, or they can take public transport. So there is less driving. Also, in a more dense city, homes are smaller, so they use less energy for heating or air conditioning. So dense cities, large cities tend to be more sustainable than, much more sustainable than the suburbs, for example, or density suburbs. And also cities can be very powerful for equality. A good city can collect taxes in high-income areas and make investments in lower-income areas, or a good city achieves that low-income and high-income people meet as equal, such as it happens in parks or in sidewalks or in public transport or even in some cultural events. I will also tell you why I think people will not want to live away in a beach. In my parents' generation, the households had about 8 children. In my generation, about 5. I have 2 children, a son and a daughter, and now households are smaller. So if there had been internet 80 years ago, people could live in a faraway beach because they would have about 100 cousins living nearby. There would be a lot of family life. They would interact all the time. But now, more and more, our family are our friends. Half our households in Scandinavia are only one person. So more and more, the people which are like our family are our friends. And more, we don't invite them to our home to dinner, for example, but we go out to eat at a restaurant or we go to a cafe. I remember I was in high school when the McDonald's for the first time began to sell breakfast. It was a weird thing because people not only have dinner outside or lunch outside, but even breakfast. So more and more the city is our home. Homes are small. We almost go there to sleep, we spend more waking time out of our homes than in our homes. So in a certain way, the city is our home. The city is that place where we spend our waking life. Also, we live longer. We live much longer, maybe 100 years. The young people who are studying at Duke now will live 100 years or some more. Would we want to be in a suburb in our old age by ourselves, where we are not even able to drive well, by ourselves without seeing people passing by? Or would it be better to be in a dense city where we go out, we see many people, we go to the cafe nearby, meet our friends? So this is the kinds of things we choose when we decide how to make our cities. Another thing, traffic will get only worse in American suburban cities, because this is a long story, but it's important to understand that what creates traffic congestion is not just the number of cars, it's the distance cars go. For example, a car that goes for 10 kilometers creates 10 times more traffic than one car that goes for 1 kilometer. So the farther and farther cities grow, the more traffic is created. We are seeing these horrible problems in California. For example, the most advanced place in the planet, the Silicon Valley, where all the advances in technology are happening, the traffic has been getting horribly worse over the last 20 years. And it's not possible, as some imagine, that we can just put public transport there, because in order for public transport to work, we need compact cities, more dense cities. In a low density cities, distances are very long, and we cannot have high frequency, low cost public transport. So the most important for mass transport system is density. We created, as Ambassador Patrick was saying, a mass transit system, bus-based mass transit. We call Transmilenio, inspired initially in the Curitiba model, but we made a lot of improvements. It moves more passengers. This system, Transmilenio, moves more passengers our direction, or more passengers per mile, than all subways in the world, except for 3 or 4. And it costs between 10 and 15 times less. So it is possible to solve mass transit problems. It is more a political decision. But if we have equality, if we have democracy and all citizens are equal before the law, clearly a bus with 200 passengers has a right to 200 times more road space than a car with 1. And these kind of systems are within the reach of any city that has the political and managerial capacity to do it. We also have done a lot of bikeways and bicycle highways, such as these you see in the picture. We have more than 100 kilometers of bicycle highways, despite the fact that Bogotá is one of the most dense cities in the planet. At this time, we have about 14% of the people go to work by car, and about nearly 10% go by bicycle. This is also important for health, for the environment, and also even for democracy, for equality, because on a bicycle, people meet as equals, even if one bicycle costs $10,000 and the other one $100. Now, how are the American cities to be built? Are they going to simply grow in farther and farther away suburbs? Or will they be located in the inner suburbs that will have to be demolished in order to change houses, individual houses, for maybe 5, 10-story high buildings? Often we think that we have to choose between Manhattan and the suburbs. No, there are different systems. In a city with 5 to 6 to 10-story high buildings, we could have very wide sidewalks. We could have hundreds of kilometers of greenways. People could move across the city by bicycle without being next to a car. But we could walk to a shop or something. If American cities continue to grow in farther and farther away suburbs, also inequality will become worse, because those who are poorest are those who will have to live farthest away. But I like to emphasize it is possible to create a city model which is neither the low density suburb of individual homes with a garden around them, nor the dense Manhattan with little green. So I think these are some ideas for Patrick to start the conversation. Thank you.
Well, Enrique, that gives us a lot to unpack. I have questions from several of our viewers that would be immediately relevant, but I would like to begin with something that I think is pretty fundamental. Latin America is the region with some of the largest cities in the world. And, you know, whether we're talking about Mexico City or Sao Paulo or Lima, as well as some of the most dense cities. Many of our largest cities in the Western Hemisphere have significant poverty and very significant crime. So to get us started, I was wondering if you could share with us your sense of where we can start to make some of our largest metropolitan centers more livable. Do we start with the problem of crime, problem of poverty, density, public transportation? What will make the biggest initial difference?
Well, it's true that Latin America has some large cities, dense cities. We have dense cities, and density now is considered good because it facilitates mass transit and it's good for the environment. But we have density not because we were great planners, but because we did not have the money the US had to make big highways and to buy cars. So it has the US model was not really a matter of planning, and ours, it was not either. But now we have these large cities. Actually, there are many large, dense cities in Asia too, giant cities such as Karachi in Pakistan, or Manila, or Delhi, or Mumbai. I believe one problem that we do have in Latin America, as you said, is crime. In Bogotá, we have been able to lower crime. For example, I just finished my term as mayor at the beginning of this year, and we were able to bring murder rate down from 18 per 100,000 inhabitants to 11 per 100,000 inhabitants. It's still very high because, for example, in Europe, it's only about 2 or 3. But, for example, in Washington, it's much higher. It's more than 20 murders per 100,000 inhabitants, or in Chicago or in Baltimore. So what can be done to improve cities and lower crime? We sometimes go together. For example, these mass transit systems create democracy also as a symbol, because when the expensive car is in a traffic jam and cannot move, and then the bus, the public transport zooms by next to it, it is a democratic symbol. It shows that public good prevails over private interest. And so this gives legitimacy to the system. The bikeway, the protected bikeway, we have now more than 700 kilometers of protected bikeways in Bogotá. It's also a symbol, not just protecting the cyclists, but it's a symbol that shows that a bicyclist on a $100 bicycle is equally important to a citizen on a $100,000 car. So these efforts to construct equality, even if unconsciously assimilated, they create legitimacy. When there is legitimacy, people tend to obey more the law, the rules. Also, for example, we built more than 1,500 parks, almost 200 soccer fields, synthetic soccer fields. By the way, at Duke, I went to Duke not because I was bright as all the people who might be watching this, but because I had a soccer scholarship. And each of these synthetic soccer fields with lights then create that the young people go there to do sports, and the community comes out of their homes and they are in the street, they are in the park, they meet each other, not just soccer fields. We made children playgrounds, all kinds of extremely high quality. And so this lowers crime as well. It lowers crime because, again, it creates legitimacy. It lowers crime because community, the people meet each other. It lowers crime because people help each other out. We also, for example, we completely changed the lighting of the city. We increased the lighting like 3 times more, and we put LED systems and so. And all of these things, cleanliness, lighting, parks, sports, and equality. For example, if we build great schools in the lowest income area, beautiful as beautiful as the best private schools in the city, and some of them, we organize a program through which they are managed by the best private schools and university. This creates also that which I call legitimacy. When there is legitimacy, when people feel their democracy is working, they tend to obey the law and to denounce those who are breaking it. Now, we have a huge crime problem still. I'm not saying we solved it.
Are you there?
Yes, I am here.
A question just came in from one of our viewers. Particularly, as you've made the comparison between people traveling back and forth in the city in very expensive automobiles versus buses or bicycles. In your experience, how should cities deal with the pushback from the wealthier parts or the wealthier communities within a given city? How do we enlist the more prosperous residents of our cities in the effort to make cities better places to live?
Well, I think the biggest obstacle to creating a good city is inequality. In developing countries, cities tend to be very unequal. Upper income people go to their country clubs or to country homes. They often don't walk out enough in the public space. They don't walk, they don't take public transport. And so this is one of the great challenges, but this is why I say when we create bus systems which take space away from cars to give it to public transport, when we create a great infrastructure, if we are able to get high-income people always meet low-income people. They always meet, but one is the owner of the apartment and the other one is the doorman at the building. Right. The wonderful thing that is when the two, they meet not separated by hierarchies, but they meet as equals, such as if they meet in public spaces, if they meet in sidewalks. Also, there is if we remember, democracy is not just the fact that people vote. Democracy is that constitutions are obeyed. And one basic principle of constitutions is that citizens are equal before the law. If that is true, public good prevails over private interest. And in some cases, for example, it's necessary even to turn golf courses into public parks, paying, of course, for the land. Also, one advantage of a city like Bogotá is that it's possible to charge taxes. Taxes really are very high for the high-income people in Bogotá. For example, the property tax for an apartment of a high-income apartment can be equivalent to about 1 to 3 monthly rentals. 1 to 3 monthly rentals. And high-income people don't receive almost any investment because their children go to private schools, they use private health. So the taxes are collected in the higher income areas and they are invested in the lower income areas. There is a huge transfer. But if the question was more oriented, what can upper income people do to help lower income people? I would say The first thing is that we get to know them better. Most upper income people in developing countries, for example, have maids or doormen at the building. If they once a year, they could drive the doorman home, or they could drive the lady who works, mostly ladies who works at their home, drive them home to get to know each other better. If we get to go, when I was a teacher at the university, I used to send my students to do work in the lowest income neighborhoods. I think if upper income and lower income people know each other better, they will learn to respect each other more and to work together better.
This raises a couple of questions for me. To go back to the issue of land and land use, how exactly would you envision acquiring the land? What would the role of government be? Would it be mandated? And where would the resources come from?
Well, I believe the most important thing for a city is to grow in the right place and in the right way. Cities are different from many other problems. Cities are different from many other problems because one of them is that if we make a mistake, it's very difficult to solve them later. For example, if we don't leave enough land for a park, if we are able to save 50 hectares for a park, this park will make people happier for 100 years, for 500 years, for 2,000 years. And if we don't save these 50 hectares for a park, it's very difficult afterwards to demolish 50 hectares of city in order to open up a park. Another thing about land, which is very interesting, is that I fully believe in private property and the market economy as the best way to manage most of society's resources. However, in some cases, it doesn't work well. For example, in the case of land around growing cities, it doesn't work well. Market economy works because, for example, if the price of tomatoes goes up, then people grow more tomatoes and the price of tomatoes goes back down. So prices tend to approach cost. In the case of land around growing cities, we can increase the price of land all we want, and the supply of land that is accessible to public transport, to jobs, to schools, to water supplies is not going to increase. So actually there is no justification for us to leave private land, to leave the land simply in private hands without any government control. So either government can buy the land when it's still rural land, when it has rural prices before it turns urban, or else there are many ways to intervene. But clearly, it is crucial. It is the most important thing is that cities grow in the right place. And this is, again, not just for cities like in Latin America, where they are growing outside. I mentioned the example in the United States. Where are the American cities going to grow? One option is farther away suburbs. And the poorest people will have to go farther and farther away and drive 2 or 3 hours in each direction in every commute. Or else we will have to demolish some inner suburbs that are closer to the center, closer to jobs, closer to education, closer to mass transport. And then we can design a whole different kind of city. But again, in this case, private market without government intervention doesn't work. Unfortunately, it is necessary for government to intervene so that cities grow in the right place, so that large parks are created. For example, I always love to remember that New York Central Park was created towards 1860, when New York was much smaller and poorer than many of cities in the developing world today. And developing world cities, almost none have done something similar to New York Central Park. But now the question again is, how are the American cities going to grow? We must accept, in my opinion, that they are growing in the wrong places, in the wrong way, in low density suburbs, totally car dependent, which will create more and more traffic, and quality of life will be affected. So I think it's possible to do a totally different city with a lot of much better pedestrian qualities, much more bicycle friendly. This is possible.
We've had several of our listeners ask for your sense of the metrics. I'd like to phrase the question this way. First, how do we know when and how do we measure the improvement in the quality of life in a city? What do you measure? Is it income? Is it crime rates? Is it somehow a function of density? What do you use to judge the quality of both change and also the ongoing quality of life in a city?
That's a great question. It's very difficult. Here we go into some things that are very difficult. I don't like very much the way the happiness has been measured by many experts over the last 20 years.
Right.
But happiness is very difficult to define. It is impossible to measure, yet it's the only thing that matters. Everything we do is to try to be happier. I think a good city is propitious for the development of the human potential. In a good city, we meet other people, and we have some needs. We have some needs that we can measure. For example, we need to walk. We need to walk, not just to go somewhere. We could live all our lives inside an apartment. We like to walk. We need to walk just as birds need to fly or deer need to run. We need to walk. We need to see people. I have seen, for example, in the cafes in many American cities, many young people with the computer working by themselves. They could be doing it in their apartment. Why do they go to the cafe? Because they want to be with people. We need to be with people. So I would say a good city is one that is good for walking. A good city is one that is good for the elderly, for the most vulnerable citizens. A good city is good for children, for the elderly, for the handicapped. We have to define certain needs. We need, for example, contact with nature, contact with water. Waterfronts should never be private and exclusive. They should be accessible to all citizens. We need contact with green. But one measure to finish with this question, which I'm not answering in a very technical or correct way, perhaps, but is the following. In 1960, the best and the brightest young American graduates, Duke graduates, for example, they had to go to where the corporation decided to set shop. So they had to go, for example, to some little town in Dow Chemical in Midland, Michigan, or to Pittsburgh, some cities people may not like, or to Detroit. And that's where they had to spend all their lives, in some city, because the corporation decided to be there. Now we are at a different time. Now capital is not so important, and what is more important is creativity, is the people with good ideas. So now corporations have to set offices in the places where the people want to live. So actually the competition for the future, we are competing not for capital, we are competing for people. Even how to attract and retain the best people, how to attract and retain the best people. And this is the way, I think, one of the ways to measure whether a city is being successful is if it is attracting those people who are so good at whatever they do that they can choose where to live. So that's a good measure, because more and more, we are not competing to attract capital. We are not competing to attract anything but people. So that's one good measure is, for example, we may in Bogotá we are far from being able to attract people from San Francisco to live in Bogotá because they think it's very much fun to live in Bogotá. But at least if we are able to keep our young, bright, well-prepared students from leaving, that's a first step.
I sense that is, it may be a first step, it's also a critically important step. Another question, to what cities do you look for inspiration? We know, many of us, something of your accomplishments in Bogotá, whether it's creating parks or building libraries, etc. But where else in the world do you see really interesting things happening in terms of urban development or urban renewal, the recreation of urban life?
Well, I say that even though cities are human habitats, unfortunately, over the last 100 years, after 1910 or so, we made cities more for cars than for people. We have had cities for 8,000 years. And for 8,000 years, all streets were for people. People met in the streets. Children played in the streets. We designed cities for people. Unfortunately, over the last 100 years, we designed very much cities more for cars. And so we have been making corrections. In the American cities, for example, they have demolished many elevated highways. I would say the best cities in the world, I tend to be in Europe. Europe, what is a good city? A city where people walk a lot, where rich and poor meet in public spaces, where children are safe. Children are almost a species indicator of what a good city is. If we see in the street, in the public spaces, we see children, we see the elderly, we see people with handicap, that tends to be a good city. If it's a good city for vulnerable people, I think, of course, there are other cities that are wonderful. By the way, again, we are, as I said at the beginning, when we are designing a city, we are designing a way of life, a way of life. So each person has a different opinion of what is it that they like. Many people, of course, in the United States, they love to be in a suburb, in a big house, perhaps with a swimming pool, and they will drive everywhere. They will drive, they will not walk to buy even a piece of bread. They will take the car, and they love it in the big house, and they have a lot of, maybe in a cul-de-sac where there is no traffic. So I'm not saying what is a good city. I say what is a good city for me, what I think, and what we can do in Bogotá. So I think there are some wonderful examples in New York, in the European cities, in Northern Europe. I like those cities where many people move by bicycle, in public transport, where there is a lot of green. And still, I think that we could do cities that are different. For example, cities in the developing world, which are going to be built from zero, from scratch, they could be very different. For example, how about one street for cars and motor vehicles, the next one only pedestrian, the next one for cars and motor vehicles, the next one only pedestrian. So we could have whole networks of hundreds of kilometers of greenways. But whatever we do, we will have to do cities more for human happiness, more for vulnerable human beings than for motor vehicles.
Now, that raises an interesting question, and it was something that was sent in by one of our listeners. In Bogotá, or in Colombians, in Bogotá specifically, you have opted for above ground public transportation systems. In other parts of the Americas, they have put their public transportation below ground. They have developed subways. I understand the attraction of green space. Wouldn't you preserve more of it if your public transportation were below ground?
Well, this is very interesting question. I believe those it's much more pleasant to go above ground than to be underground. I think most of the people who are listening will have been in a subway, underground subway, that sometimes comes out of the ground, comes out to go across a river, a bridge, or just comes out. For example, in New York, there are many subway lines that go underground and then come out. And when the train comes out to the surface, oh, you feel such a relief. You feel such a relief because there is so much less noise. It's so nice to see the natural light. It's much more pleasant to be on the surface. So I would say people who ride a bicycle are social heroes. They are helping the rest of society. People who use public transport are social heroes. They are helping so that there is less pollution, there is less traffic. And so why put them on the ground? Why put them on the ground? As much as possible, I believe we should put public transport above ground on the surface and put cars underground, put private cars, those opposite to public transport, which public transport users are contributing to society. Car use generates a lot of social costs, traffic, global warming, all kinds of things. So now, in Europe, cities in Europe grew for hundreds of years when there were not only not cars, but there were not even trams, nothing. So they have, the city centers are very compact, and they have a maze of little narrow streets. It is not possible to put mass transit on the surface. The only way to go across those cities is underground. Sometimes it's necessary to go underground. Developing country cities, which mostly grew after 1950, most developing country cities really 80 or 90% of their area grew after 1940, 1950. It's different. They have, even if they don't have a good road network, they have some large roads. And so the question is, how do we use those roads? How do we use them? How do we distribute? This is a question of democracy, of equity. How do we distribute road space between pedestrians, bicyclists, public transport, and cars? For example, a bus lane that, like the Transmilenio lane, moves up to normally about 30 to 40 times more people than a car lane. But if the car lane, as is usual, is jammed, it can move up to 80 times more people than a car lane. Now, I also, as mayor, last time I contracted an elevated subway. First, it costs much less. Second, the subway, the soils in Bogotá are very bad. It's very difficult and very expensive to put subways underground. So if it's possible, I also think it will be much more pleasant. Of course, even though aesthetically for the city is not the best necessarily, for the passengers is much more pleasant. So I believe that as much as possible, we should put public transport above the surface. One more thing, what creates mass transit is not the metal wheels or the rubber wheels. No, that's not. It's the exclusive right of way. Exclusive right of way with no interruptions. And more, in a matter of 10 or 15 years, all buses will be electric and driverless. So it's not much of a difference with our buses. For example, are three-bodied buses which carry 250 people. What is the difference between a convoy of these three-bodied buses, which can carry 700, 800 people, and a rail system? It's not much of a difference, and they have a lot of flexibility. They cost much less. So these are the kinds of things. One last comment. Upper income people, you look, in terms of transport, what makes an advanced city is not that low income people drive cars, but rather that high income people use public transport. Upper income people in developing countries, one of the things that makes a difference between an advanced and a backward city is that upper income citizens don't use public transport. However, they all want metros. If you ask any of the people, any of your friends, Patrick, any of your friends in Latin America, most of them who are in the higher income echelons, and they all want subways. They definitely, preferably they're underground subways, but none of them have the slightest intention of getting into a subway. They has not crossed their minds. What they want subways for is to put lower income people underground so they don't even have to see them, in the hope that they will not have as much traffic. For example, Mexico City. Mexico City has the longest network of metro of any developing country city in the world. Now, I want you to ask any of the Mexican students at Duke, or any of the friends you have in Mexico, which I know are many. Don't ask them if they use the metro. Ask them if they, once in their life, have been to the metro, just to know it, just to get to know it. And I can assure you, 99% of the times, none of the Mexicans you know even have been to the metro once in their lives. So this is an interesting equity issue.
That was a fascinating answer. And thank you very much for that. Now I'm getting questions virtually every 10 seconds here from some of our listeners. So I'm going to try to give you, we won't call this the lightning round, but I'm going to try to shoot you 2 or 3 questions rather quickly. One question is, how do you deal, and I'll give you 2 or 3 questions together. One would be, how do you deal with the political challenge of sustaining an urban development plan over time? Because obviously political leadership is critically important, but often changes, and changes more quickly than many urban programs can be implemented. So that's one question. A second question is really touches on educational policy. Do you think, for instance, a particular concentration on the STEM areas, on the science, technology, mathematics, and engineering fields, is that something that people concerned with quality cities should be looking at? And then a third question, which is really a question in 2 parts. Does government subsidized housing for lower income families help? And on the flip side of that, how to contend with the extraordinarily high cost of property in some of our more desirable cities? So that's 3 or 4 questions in a row from some of our listeners this evening.
Very good questions. Thank you. Well, how to get continuity? I must say that I'm a bad politician. I have lost many elections. Amazingly, I won twice the election as mayor of Bogotá. But the mayor who succeeded me, for example, killed many projects we had in the pipeline. However, my experience is that if it's a good project, and if you make the designs, the engineering designs, and they are left there, maybe the next mayor won't do it, but then the next one or one after will do it. Another thing is that when the projects are good enough, for example, the Transmilenio bus systems, many mayors after me have been against me, have been in opposition. And the bus system, the Transmilenio, is very much identified with me. And for example, the last mayor who was elected made a campaign a lot against Transmilenio. However, if the project has the logic and is good, there is nothing else it can be done. It's not done. For example, a Transmilenio costs 10 to 15 times less than a subway. So we have at this time 114 kilometers of Transmilenio, which moves 2.5 million people per day. And now they are building almost an increase of almost 60%. And every single mayor, I created Transmilenio when I was mayor between 98 and 2001. And every single mayor which has come after has extended the Transmilenio system. Besides, of course, it has been imitated in hundreds of cities around the world. But so if the project is good, sometimes it becomes unavoidable. It has continuity. I think this is the only way that projects have continuity. If they are good, sometimes the new mayor, they change the name, they change the color, whatever. But some other things cannot. For example, anyway, I don't have time now.
Okay.
Whether you ask me whether if engineering was good, the education, the sciences. I hear in this areas. Yeah, I believe that in Latin America, at least in Colombia, we need much more education in the math and science. For example, I hear that in Japan, which has 120 million inhabitants, they have only like 30,000 lawyers. And in Colombia, which only has 50 million inhabitants, I think there may be that much who graduate every year, 30,000 lawyers every year or something. So I think it would be, but in order to design a city, I would not say that you need any special qualification. I think we need to put ourselves in the shoes of an old person. We should remember that most of us, perhaps, or many of us, will end up our days in a wheelchair. How would we want our city to be? Or a child? I don't think it's so much a technical thing, but as a society, beyond the urban issue, I do believe that we need more and more people who are specialized in science, because also there is a problem that many people talk pseudoscience. They make pseudoscience statements, pseudoscientist statements without real scientific backing. So the more rational we become, one of the things that worries me in the world at this time is that we are becoming perhaps a little less rational and we care less about truth and reason. So everything that makes us a little more rational, I think is good for progress in general. Now, subsidized housing. I do believe that now, Colombia had a program where they give free housing to people. I don't like the free housing projects because it's more efficient to give maybe half of the house free and then give some other financial schemes to the people so they get more of a sense of belonging, and is better. And also because you can do more housing, because we don't have enough money to give a free house to everybody. But I do believe to subsidize housing is good. Not to give it for free, the whole house. But clearly, there are many ways to subsidize housing. We could go into this for this, but in order to refer to what we are talking about today, it's very important that we do good urban design, not just worry about the cost of the housing. For example, we should have wide sidewalks. We should have bikeways. We should have parks, small and large, greenways. So we should be careful that the low-income housing has quality urban design. But I do believe that it's a very good way to, by the way, one of the ways to activate the economy after COVID now, one of the best sectors to subsidize is housing construction, because it has a high component of local ingredients, a lot of employment, a lot of local raw materials, and the demand is also saving. It's an expenditure which is at the same time a saving, so it has many advantages. Now, the last question, the high cost of what? Of what? I forgot what was the last one.
Of property, in some of the
Oh,
more
yes, the high cost of property, yes. I believe, for example, one of the wonderful things that you see is that parks are so important. One of the things that we have felt over this COVID crisis is the need for green, the need to contact with nature. And parks are so important, or contact with nature, with a riverfront, a lakefront, a park, is that homes are more expensive the closer they are to the park. So the way to lower the price of housing is to increase the supply. But ideally, with how can you increase the supply? We have to have green spaces, the new supply, so that it can compete with the existing expensive areas, and great public transport, so that even if it's relatively far, you can reach all places of the city very quickly. So there is, but clearly, the price of housing has many implications. It's extremely related to the interest rates. As soon as interest rates go down, then the prices of homes go up. Because, but this is a long story. This is a long story to discuss. But what I believe is clearly important to increase the supply of housing in high quality urban environments, which are well connected by transit. And this is the only possible solution to extremely high prices for housing that I can imagine.
I'm going to ask you now, if I may, a pair of questions. One that was sent in earlier, but I think that we should at least touch on it. And that is how to contend with corruption, because it is in fact as, or maybe even more common in big cities than in smaller cities or suburban areas. So that's one question. And a second question, which comes to us from Buenos Aires, and I think is very interesting, has to do with our concern for the environment and the carbon emission targets and other kinds of things that emerged from the Paris Agreement. How important were environmental concerns for you, and how important do you think they should be to urban planners going forward?
Excellent. Well, there are many laws to prevent corruption. I don't believe very much in that. I believe that it is a way of life, the way you do politics. For example, I never accepted money from contractors, from city contractors or public contractors in any way. I went out to the street. I never, people in the politics often give money to local leaders. Never. There is not one leader in the city of Bogotá which can say that I gave him $100 even to buy soft drinks for a meeting. Nothing. So I think that almost corruption almost begins with the lies that politicians use, with calumny. When the truth is not important, that's a little beginning of corruption. I believe, how we, for example, I built some 4 big, beautiful libraries, and I realized that functionally, it would have been perhaps better instead of one of these big libraries to have built 10 smaller ones. They would be closer to the people and all that. But I wanted to create some temples, some symbols that would show to the citizens that in society, those who are important is more important those who know, a professor, somebody who knows, a scientist, that somebody who simply has money, who can be just a drug trafficker. So if we make beautiful libraries that are more beautiful than the shopping mall, we almost create a certain kind of value. The way churches that made big cathedrals also were symbols that reflected the values of a society, but they forged them as well. If we are able that in the low-income neighborhood, the hero of the neighborhood is a young person who does music or does sports and goes in an old bicycle and does sports, and not the one who is in a fancy motorcycle with fancy clothes or jewels because they sell drugs. So then we are creating different values. I believe that, of course, there can be many laws against corruption, and I hope they can be, but more than the laws, I believe is the way you do politics from the start, how do your politics are done, and it has to do with everything you do with your own life. And as I say, even when people use calumny and lies, this is the beginning of corruption. As Mark Twain, I once read, said that a lie can go around the world before truth has even put its boots on. But now, as for the environment, it's extremely important. Again, as I mentioned, the biggest challenge we have today is global warming. If we have suburban development, we have large homes which take up a lot of heating and or cooling, and so if we have a dense city where people live in small homes which take up much less heating and cooling, then it's much more sustainable. By the way, Bogotá, I will tell you, has the perfect temperature in the world. It's like a fall temperature. It's never too cool or too hot. If you are too cool, you put on a sweater. If it's too hot, you take the sweater off. So the energy is not used in heating or cooling, because the homes don't have heating or cooling, the buildings don't have heating, but in transportation. That's what eats up the most energy. And so in order to have low energy consumption, we need to have sustainable mobility, such as mobility in public transport, in buses, in trains, in bicycles. For sustainable mobility to work, the most important thing is for cities to be compact. In a compact city, in a dense city, all sustainable mobility works well. Trains, trams, buses, bicycles, even taxis. In a spread out city, nothing that is sustainable works well. It's impossible to move it's impossible to have low cost, high frequency rail systems or buses or bicycles. So the most environmentally sustainable city is the one that is compact and it has a lot of green. It's compact and people can move around walking, by bicycle, in public transport. But for that, again, much more important than to choose between trains or buses is that the city is compact. Once the city is dense, all sustainable mobility works well. If the city is spread out, no sustainable mobility works well.
Terrific. We have time for one more very quick question and answer. You have been a revelation for, I think, many of us. And I am personally very, very delighted to have been able to host you this evening. As we close, I was wondering if you could address one question or one message, a brief message to the private sector, what would you want to tell them in terms of enlisting their help to make our cities more livable?
Well, first of all, thank you very much, Patrick. Thank you very much for your words, for your questions, and I fully believe in private sector. I believe that the private property and the market are the best way to manage most of society's resources. And not because it's good for the rich, but because it's good for the poor, for society. It's the best way to manage society's resources. There has been a lot of discussion recently about income distribution. And people are very worried that some people make billions of dollars because this creates inequality. I think it's fine if we talk about and there are many famous books about the income distribution. I think more important than income distribution is consumption distribution. Because, for example, not to mention Bill Gates or others, for example, Mr. Bloomberg, he may make $10 billion a year. But in fact, he only spends maybe for his livelihood, maybe two of the 10 billion. The other 9,998, he reinvests. So actually, he's only managing society's resources. So I think this needs to be understood. I was a little worried by some of the extreme positions of some candidates even in the American election, because people don't understand well the market system. So I think what I like to say to businessmen are really, they have a public responsibility. They are managing society's resources. Why does private property and the market exist? Because we, in all societies, decided it was the best way to manage society's resources. There is nothing sacred about private property. If we ever found that it was not the best way to manage society's resources, we could do away with private property in Congress in a couple of months. Why don't we do it? Because we think the best thing for society is for to manage most of resources through private property and the market. But now, this implies responsibilities. I think I am very worried that the problem is not that people make a lot of money. The problem is that there is some conspicuous consumption, conspicuous gross consumption, extravagant mansions or yachts or crazy private planes or things. These kinds of things take away legitimacy from the system. I was just reading, for example, today an amazing story in the New York Times about a couple of scientists in Germany who are really the souls and the heart and souls behind the vaccine that Pfizer is developing. And these two scientists, which are billionaires on their own, they have a very middle-class apartment. They don't have a car. They ride a bicycle to work. And so this is my thing. When we have extravagant consumptions, extravagant fancy cars that cost hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars, and yachts and crazy things, then this takes away legitimacy from the system. So I think if I would only like to tell the big businessmen, I fully believe that you manage society's resources is much better than if government manages those resources. But the fact that you are not government does not mean that you have some responsibility, that you are managing society's resources. And if we want to defend the market system, the owners of capital must be careful and must be austere. They have to be austere. They cannot flaunt in extravagant ways their wealth, because this will corrode the basis of private property and the system. That would be my recommendation.
That was terrific. Thank you again on behalf of the Development Office of the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies of Duke University. As a son of Duke, you make us all proud. Thank you very much. And to our listeners around the United States and the Americas, good evening.
Thank you very much, Patrick, and thank you for this opportunity to the Duke Development Office.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Thank you to Senor Peñalosa, Ambassador Duddy. I would like to thank the special events team in our office, Kathy Wright, Stacy Dalton, my colleague Julie Cooney, the co-chairs of the Duke Hispanic and Latino Alumni Association, Ricardo Duque and Tatiana Salvador. Thank you all so much for your assistance in putting this together tonight. For those of you still with us, we want to highlight the next in the series of conversations with leaders in Latin America and the Caribbean. That will be February 4th with Luis Alberto Moreno, the recent president of the International Development Bank. We will be sending all of you the recording of tonight's event in the next few days. And if you have any questions and any interest in getting engaged with Duke and with the communities in your own cities throughout the region, please don't hesitate to write to me. You'll see my email being sent out in our follow-up. Thanks to everyone for joining us, and have a great night.